Hey everyone, in this video I want to touch on something, or I want to cover a moral theory that's a little bit different from the ones that we've covered so far. I'll save how it's different for a little bit later in the video, but suffice it to say that pretty much all of the theories that we've considered up until this point have been some variety of there's some moral principle that guides action, and it's not always really clear where that principle is supposed to come from. I mean, for instance, utilitarians, they tell us that the greatest happiness principle is the thing that matters, right? At least if you're of the John Stuart Mill variety of utilitarian. And, they can kind of explain where that comes from by saying things like pleasure is good, pain is bad, so obviously we should maximize pleasure. But even there, it's not obvious that it follows from the fact that pleasure is good and pain is bad, that we should maximize utility. After all, Kantians are likely to agree that pleasure is good and pain is bad, but they don't have a greatest happiness principle. All of that just to say, today's theory, I think, does a really nice job of telling us exactly where it is that morality is supposed to come from. And as with every theory that we've covered so far, you'll notice that there are some problems, right? And we'll talk about those as well. But you can line this one right up with all of the other theories that we've discussed where they're viable, right? So this is also a viable theory. Anyway, that's enough preamble. Let's go ahead and get started. And here's the first, the assumption that we'll be making today, that I think is a pretty safe assumption to make, and that is that we are self-interested individuals. Okay, so that actually bears some spelling out. When I say that we're self-interested, I'm not saying that we're selfish, right? At least not necessarily. Surely some of us are selfish, but not necessarily everybody. However, there probably are no exceptions when I say that everybody is self-interested. And all it means to be self-interested is that you yourself weigh into your decision making, right? Your own well-being matters when you're making decisions, and of course you would like to be as well off as possible. Not that you would necessarily place yourself in front of the interests of others. I'm sure that you would sacrifice yourself for your loved ones and what have you, but nonetheless, all things being equal, you also want to make sure that you're doing well, right? That you're faring well. And that's going to play a huge role in what we're going to talk about today. So just keep that in mind, right? We're all self-interested. We all want to make sure that we're well off. We all care that we, fare as well off as possible, all things being equal. Okay, so now let's consider something that I'm sure you've all, or most of you have heard about before. I'll set the stage for it. So imagine that you and some other individual, let's say an acquaintance, right? So not necessarily a best friend or anything, but you and some acquaintance have committed a crime. Maybe you robbed a bank, right? So let's say you robbed a bank. You had your face covered, right? So the cameras, they saw that some people robbed the bank, but they didn't see who it was. And now imagine that a bit further on down the line, the police, the detectives, they've managed to zero in on you and your acquaintance, right? So they suspect both of you having committed the crime. The evidence is pretty strong, what have you. And now they're really just looking for a confession. So here's what they do. They grab the two of you, they take you over to the police station, and they, shove you in separate rooms so you can't talk to one another. But you are both aware, though, that you're there and that the other is there as well, right? And that you're both being interrogated. Now, the detective comes up to you, and just for the record, they're doing this to the other person as well, to your acquaintance, right? So that your acquaintance is going to hear the exact same thing that you're about to hear. And the detective tells you the following. The other person in the other room, they're on the verge of cracking, right? So they're about to tell us what we want to know, and they're, of course, going to implicate you. So they're going to snitch on you, right? Now, it's in your own best interest that you snitch on them. Here's why. It turns out, so you've only got two options, right? You can either keep quiet, right, which would be the noble thing to do, or you can snitch, right? Let's just say. If you both snitch, then, let's say you both keep quiet. If you both keep quiet, you will both serve 2 years each, okay? So you'll go to prison, you both kept quiet, the evidence is enough, right? So you'll both go to prison for 2 years. If, on the other hand, you both snitch, right, so you both tell on one another, then you will both go to prison for, let's say, 6 years, right? So quite a bit worse than if you both keep quiet. However, if you keep quiet and the other person snitches, then you get 10 years and they get to go free. On the other hand, if you snitch and they keep quiet, then you get to go free and they get 10 years. So that might be a lot of information. Let's simplify it. Both of you keep quiet, both of you get 2 years each. Both of you snitch, both of you get 6 years each. One of you keeps quiet and the other snitches, and the person who kept quiet gets 10 years, right? And the other person gets to go free. The way that this is laid out, so this is a prisoner's dilemma, right? That's what this is called. You may have heard this before, right? And I mean, it's aptly named because we're concerned with two would-be prisoners. The prisoner's dilemma is basically a collective action problem. Here's why it's a problem. Clearly, what's best for the collective, right? So what's best for the group, in this case, the group is just the two of you, is for both of you to keep quiet, right? And that would be the best outcome. However, what's going to happen, the absolute vast majority of the time, certainly if everyone is rational, so if both of you are rational, what's absolutely guaranteed to happen in that case is that you're both going to snitch and you're both going to end up going to prison for 6 years. But why? Let's dissect this a little bit. Why is it that it's rational to always snitch? And I'm telling you now, right? That is actually the most rational thing for you to do, even if you know that collectively that's the worst situation for both of you, right? Well, consider what your options are, and there aren't very many. Okay, so suppose that you're really imagine yourself right now being interrogated, right? Now, while you're sitting, suppose that the detective came in, told you, okay, these are your options, and then the detective, leaves, and now you're just by yourself, so you have a few minutes to contemplate what you want to do. So you start thinking and you wonder, okay, well, there are really only two things that might happen with my partner, right? My partner in crime. They are either going to snitch or they're going to remain quiet. If they remain quiet, then I have two choices, right? And one of them is the clear winner. If they remain quiet and I snitch, I am self-interested after all, and this is just an acquaintance. If they remain quiet and I snitch, then I get no time whatsoever. Whereas if I snitch, right, if they remain quiet and I snitch, then I get no time whatsoever. Whereas if I remain quiet, then I get 2 years. 0 years versus 2 years, it's no contest, right? Obviously, what I should do if they remain quiet is snitch, right? Because that's what's going to be best for me. Alternatively, the person in the other room might snitch. If they snitch, once again, I have only two choices. If they snitch and I keep quiet, I get 10 years, and that would be horrible. Whereas if they snitch and I snitch, right, then I get 6 years. 6 years versus 10 years, once again, no contest. So both cases, regardless of whether they snitch or keep quiet, the most rational thing for me to do, right, in my own self-interest, is to snitch. And of course, your partner in the other room is going to be thinking exactly the same thing, right? They're also going to be thinking this way. So what's going to happen? You're both going to prison, right? And you're both going to prison for 6 years because you've been cornered by your own self-interest. Right? Now, there are ways out of the prisoner's dilemma, right? We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But at this point, what I want to say is acting in our own self-interest, even when we're being perfectly rational, when we are caught in a prisoner's dilemma, and there are many situations where we end up in a prisoner's dilemma, acting in our own self-interest can still hurt us. It's better than not acting in your self-interest and the other person snitching, right? But obviously, why would you do that? It's much better to just behave in your self-interest in this case. Now, Schaefer-Landau, I think, goes a little bit too far, and I forget if he envisions that it's like your best friend or something like that. He says that no matter what, everybody would always snitch under all sets of circumstances. That's not true, and that's fine. Oftentimes, people will behave in a way that's self-interested in this way, but not necessarily, right? If that person were someone that you seriously love and really care about and what have you, you may have compelling reasons because you care about their self-interest to just keep quiet, and they may think the same thing, right? That's why I made this person out to just be an acquaintance. It's not someone you're that close with. It's certainly not someone you can trust that much, right? In that case, obviously, what it's rational to do is to snitch. All right, so I've spent enough time on this. So let's keep moving. Okay, so along comes this guy, Thomas Hobbes, right? And this is where we're starting to move into the new moral theory. And Hobbes believes that prior to the existence of a state, right, so a government, we were, and if the state were to collapse, would once again be in what he calls a state of nature. So what is a state of nature? Simply this: it's a state in which there is no state, right? In which there is no government. Anarchy, right? So if there were no one in command, if there were no one at the top, and this of course isn't to say anything about what the best governmental system is or anything like that, but the point is, if there were no government whatsoever, then we would be in a state of nature. Okay, so what is the state of nature? According to Hobbes, it's the absolute worst possible state that humanity can be in, because it turns every single interaction with other humans into a prisoner's dilemma, right? Because now everybody is out just for themselves, right? So you can imagine the sort of chaos that would happen, and Schaefer-Landau brings up some examples. There are some real states of nature in the world, and what happens is just that you usually end up getting some mob bosses or warlords or what have you who are hoarding the resources, right? Because the resources are finite. And in everyone's, fight for survival and everyone's attempt to serve their own self-interests, they end up making decisions that ultimately make the whole of society much worse off, right? So this is also a collective action problem, right? Obviously, if we all worked together, we would all be much better off. Let me actually rephrase that just a little bit. Some of us will be better off in a state of nature, right? Usually the person at the top. As a sidebar, I'm not sure that's actually true. I feel like that would probably be a very difficult life. Yeah, fine, you've got material resources, but you're constantly looking over your shoulder, making sure no one's trying to kill you, because everyone is probably trying to kill you. But that aside, the point is, fine, there would be some people in the state of nature who would fare well, but the absolute vast majority of people would be living horrific lives that they absolutely do not want to live. What Hobbes proposes, and this is where our theory now starts to come in, is that people construct a social contract. Right? And this is where our moral theory comes in. So let me just make sure that I've covered everything that I wanted to say. So given a state of nature, everyone's always going to defect. Defecting meaning just serve their own self-interest and not try to do what's best for others. So we need rules, right? We need a system. We need something that can assure us that by sacrificing our freedom, and realize a state of nature, that's as free as you can get. It's not great, but it is free, right? No one can tell you what to do unless, of course, they're significantly more powerful than you. But you can, of course, try to kill them in their sleep, whatever, right? There are no rules. There's just survival of what people often incorrectly call survival of the fittest, right? Anyway, so the social contract is supposed to come in order to save everybody, right? And the idea is this: you give up your freedom so that you may build a government. And that government is, of course, we'll talk more about this, but that's the enforcer of the social contract. And by giving up a lot of your freedoms, you can secure a much better life for yourself. The vast majority of people will fare better living in a civilized society, right? Living in a society where there are rules, where everybody, of course, doesn't try to kill their neighbors and doesn't try to steal and whatnot, so that we can all be better off. Okay, so this is a view known as social contract theory or contractarianism or contractualism or whatever it is that you want to call it. The name ultimately doesn't matter. What's really important is this is a moral theory. Now, we haven't covered any of the details yet. We haven't discussed what the contract is, what have you. But the idea is this: the social contract, whatever it may turn out to be, is what determines your moral obligations. And one of the nice things about this view is that it tells you, unlike utilitarianism, unlike Kantian ethics, that's debatable, right? But unlike some of these other theories, it tells you exactly where it is that morality comes from. It's just an agreement, right? It's an agreement. And this is, by the way, not a form of moral relativism at all. Quite the contrary. The social contract view is an objective moral theory. It tells you exactly what it is that it's right to do and what it's wrong to do. What it's right to do and what it's wrong to do is whatever it is that a rational, free, equal group of individuals would agree to, right? And I'll spell out those details a little bit more, because obviously you might wonder, okay, what would they agree to? How would they come together to do that? So on and so forth, right? Okay, but first let's just talk about... let's go ahead and actually just dive right into how it is that we determine what the social contract is supposed to be. Okay, so here there are a number of ways this might happen, and Hobbes, the way that Hobbes thought of this is different from the way that John Rawls thought about it. And this is the first time that you're hearing the name John Rawls, very, very influential political philosopher. Here's how Rawls thinks that the social contract would come about. So I want you to imagine that you step into this, I don't know, veil, right? So that's what Rawls calls it, right? Here's what happens. When you step into the veil, you lose all of your identifying features, right? So you don't know what your race is or your ethnic background. You don't know which cultural group you'll belong to. You don't know what your religious beliefs will be. You don't know your socioeconomic status. You don't know any of those usually very politically and morally relevant features, right? The only thing you have is your ability to reason, but all of those other memories are gone. And now imagine that you're in the process of trying to figure out which rules should govern society, right? Well, you would pick rules that would be as beneficial for everybody as possible because you have absolutely no idea where in society you are, right? You don't know if you're going to be poor. You don't know if you're going to be rich. You don't know what the color of your skin is going to be or what your religious beliefs are going to be. So presumably you're going to pick rules that are as kind and just and fair as possible, right? Because you're going to hope that when you step out of that veil, society's rules benefit you as well, right? So you're not going to pick rules. For instance, you wouldn't make it so that only the rich, right, get to make political decisions, because what if you end up being poor, right? And given that resources are scarce, there's a much greater chance that you're going to end up being poor than there is that you're going to end up being rich. So John Rawls called this the veil of ignorance. And the idea was this: the social contract, right, is whatever it is that people within the veil of ignorance would choose it to be. So whatever rules they would decide would be the ones that govern society. That's what the social contract is supposed to be. What rules are those? Well, rational people can disagree about this, right? Because unfortunately there is no veil of ignorance and we can't really figure out what it is that we would ultimately decide upon. But that doesn't actually matter. Why? Well, because the way that this is phrased, it's not about what rules people actually have determined. It's about what the ideal reasoner would determine, right? So we could be wrong about that, right? We might think, oh, well, our society right now, let's say the United States, has this set of rules. Clearly, some of these aren't working, right? Like things aren't exactly the way that they should be. We've made some mistakes. No contractarian would say, okay, well, that's too bad. The U.S. is the final say. This is not moral relativism, right? What the contractarian would say is, we haven't figured out exactly which rules the ideal reasoners would come into agreement on, right? Okay, so let's see, what am I missing here? Right, okay, so the only thing that matters right now is, according to the social contract theory, right, what determines morality is whatever it is that, this part's important, rational, free, equal people, right, would agree upon. And of course, those people, if you're Rawls, would have to be ideal reasoners. Hobbes doesn't need that, right? Hobbes thinks that it's sufficient that they be free, equal, etc. Okay, so anyway, that determines the social contract. And once you have your social contract, that tells you what it's morally right and wrong to do. For instance, what are some of these rules we would expect? Well, we would probably expect certain rules concerning property. We would expect certain rules concerning contracts. What are contracts? Contracts are just promises, right? So I promise to render X service in exchange for Y compensation, right? Okay, so obviously we would make all of these types of rules, right? We would decide the right procedures for these things, and that's why I shouldn't murder anybody. No rational, free, equal person would permit murder in their society, right? It would make for, first of all, it would just be the state of nature, right? And it would make for a very dysfunctional society. And these rules have moral force. And it's not hard to see where that moral force comes from. Because to violate the rules is, and this might sound familiar, to treat yourself as an exception, right? And you don't have any good reason ever to treat yourself as an exception because we are all equals, right? That's how the contract is determined. So it sounds Kantian, but it isn't Kantian. It's not about universalizability. It's about agreement. Consent is what brings about the social contract, right? And consent seems like a pretty important thing to determine how it is that we should be living. Now, it's not enough to just have a contract. There's more to the social contract theory, but that is a huge component of it. The other component is enforcement. You need an enforcer. right? If we just made contracts, if we just had promises and there were nothing to enforce that, so like, I don't know, for instance, maybe I want someone to like fix up my house, right? Suppose I'm an awful person, right? So we go ahead, we write out the contract, they go ahead and they do whatever work on my house, they paint it or fix something or whatever, and there's no one to enforce when I go ahead and I say, you know what, I don't feel like paying you. Well, that wouldn't work, right? Unfortunately, if there's no one to enforce, then no one's ever going to come to fix my house, right? Because how can they guarantee that they're going to get their funds? Okay, so you need an enforcer. In our society, right, the enforcer is the state. It's complicated, right? But of course, you've got the federal government, the state government, you've got the police, you've got the army, blah, 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 blah. Right? You got a bunch of stuff that serves to enforce rules. Some penalties are criminal, some penalties are civil, what have you. But the point is, there are penalties. Right? Somewhere down the line, there's some kind of coercion. It doesn't have to be literal physical force. It doesn't even have to be that you're going to be thrown in prison. But for instance, if you haven't paid a certain debt, if it's to the government, you might have your assets freezed, right? There are all sorts of these incentives to make sure that you abide by these rules that are supposed to make things fair for all of us, right? That's the reason that I'm willing to sign certain contracts. That's the reason that I'm willing to, I guess there are more reasons why I'm willing to follow speed limits. But let's be honest here. If the road is completely empty, there's no one on the road, and the speed limit is 55, and I'm on the highway, the only reason that I really want to go at 55, 60, whatever, is because I know that I'll get a ticket otherwise, right? Otherwise, who cares? There's no one on the road. It's just me, right? So we need these things to make sure that people behave the way that they're supposed to. All right, so who is the enforcer? According to Thomas Hobbes, the enforcer is supposed to be a king. Obviously we've moved past that. Though Hobbes was pretty serious about it being a king, it was important that there be one person at the top, what have you. I wonder why Hobbes said that while he lived under the rule of a king, who would be really upset if Hobbes had said anything else, right? But it doesn't matter who the enforcer is as long as there is an enforcer, right? In our case, it's the government. And we bestow that enforcer with certain privileges, right? To, remove our freedoms. Right? This enforcer is going to make sure that I don't go around killing. That is a restriction on my freedom. It's a good one, right? I shouldn't be free to do that kind of thing, but it's a restriction on your freedom nonetheless. And it puts the enforcer in a sort of special position, right? We don't let regular everyday people take the law into their own hands because we're equals, right? They don't have that right. They're not the enforcer. They're not supposed to be the enforcer, right? That's why we have a government that's supposed to take care of all of this. Again, another aside, and we'll talk about this momentarily, I'm not trying to say that the government is perfect or that the government should have all of the powers that it does have or anything like that. I'm remaining neutral on all of that, right? The point is, given social contract theory, there needs to be an enforcer. And given that you have the ideal set of rules, then it would make sense for that enforcer to ensure that those rules are always followed. It's consistent with this that actual real cases of governments be corrupt and not enforce rules correctly and not even have the right rules and so on and so forth, right? The social contract theorist, again, not being a relativist, would just say that we have not found the right rules, right? The right rules are, again, whatever it is that these rational, free, equal, perfect reasoners would agree to. One last thing that I want to say about social contract theory before we move on to its problems and other things that I want to talk about. You are allowed to break the rules sometimes, even on social contract theory. So for instance, Hobbes believed that you were supposed to even go to prison, right? Even if things are not faring well for you, you have to follow, whatever the punishments are that are doled out by the state. But you were not required to sacrifice your life. That's not allowed, right? Let me rephrase that. It's not that it's not allowed. You're allowed to fight back, right? And that's because the whole point of the social contract is ultimately to respect your self-interest, right? Not saying that people are selfish, right? But they are self-interested. And the social contract is the best way of ensuring that most of us are as well off as possible. Well, I'm not going to be well off at all if the state comes after me, right? To kill me, to put me on death row or what have you. So there, Hobbes would say, you're absolutely allowed to defect, right? You can run away, you can kill those that are trying to kill you, because it would be utterly irrational to ask people to lay down their lives for the social contract, which exists primarily to preserve their self-interest. Now, whether Hobbes is right about that or not, the point here is that contractarianism makes a lot of room for civil disobedience, right? Because the whole point of the rule, or of the rule of law, is to ensure that all of us are taken care of, right? Is to ensure that I give up my freedoms in exchange for something, right? In exchange for security, in exchange for a place in our society, etc. So, for instance, if the rules are not just, if the rules are not fair, then people are allowed to break those rules. Now, it doesn't mean that you can get all willy-nilly, right? But you can disobey them, right? So this is where you have your the civil rights movement, right? Where what Martin Luther King was trying to do was exactly that, right? And the justification is really straightforward. These rules aren't serving a section of, a large number of the people who are citizens of this society, right, or who are residents or what have you. These rules are unfair, right? These people are giving away their freedoms and they're not getting anything in return, or what they're getting in return just isn't good enough, right? Because it's not what everyone is supposed to have access to. In those cases, contractarians would say, of course, you're allowed to disobey the law, right? Sure, there are certain limits. We can argue about what those limits are, whatever. But the point is, you're not required to obey the law all the time, no matter what, right? You're required only to obey those laws which are just, right? Those laws which are fair. And this is, of course, an instance in which justice and fairness are the same, right? They come together. Because, again, the whole point is these are the rules that equal free people would agree to. I know I'm saying that a lot, but I don't know, sometimes repetition is useful. Okay, so is there anything else here that I think I need to talk about? Yeah, there are probably 10,000 other things worth talking about, but I'm not here to teach you all of social contract theory, just enough of it. Okay, so there are problems, right? Always. There is a lot to be said for social contract theory. It gets a lot of things right. It gives you a clear procedure, right, for figuring out what's morally right and what's morally wrong. And it gives you all of the justification that you need for following the rules, right? And from abstaining from breaking them, even if you stand to benefit. However, therein lies our very first problem. So this first problem is called the free rider problem, right? Okay, so you may have heard about free riders before, you may not. A free rider is just somebody who benefits from a system that people, sacrifice to sustain without sacrificing anything themselves. And free riding happens all the time, right? So for instance, here's a really basic case of free riding. We all pay taxes, right? We're supposed to. And there's a reason for that. And again, we can argue about whether the taxes that we pay are too much, too little, whether they're serving the right types of programs, whatever. But the point is, in any organized society, you're going to have to pay some taxes. So suppose that we have the perfect society, right? Suppose that we've got all of the right rules, the social contract, we've figured it out. Great. And so we're all paying our taxes and we're all happy about where our taxes are going. Great. Okay, so the whole point of social contract theory is to serve our self-interests. And of course, the best way to do that, says Hobbes, says Rawls, etc., is to sacrifice, right? To give some portion of our freedoms away so that we may benefit, so that we don't live in a state of nature. However, you can free ride without collapsing into a state of nature. And in fact, free riding serves your self-interests, right? And it serves them quite well. So suppose we're all paying our taxes, and one day you sit down and you wonder, should I? Maybe I could just cheat on my taxes. Now here's the thing. If you don't pay your share of the taxes, literally nothing will happen to society. Society will continue to function just fine. Because the amount that you pay is a drop in the ocean, right? Because there are millions of taxpayers. So if you don't pay your particular taxes, so long as everyone else still pays their taxes, you can free ride. You can benefit from the parks, the roads, the libraries. You can benefit from the healthcare in the places that have it, right, et cetera, et cetera. You can enjoy all of those freedoms, and you can keep your money, right? You don't have to actually pay it. Okay, so why is this a problem for social contract theory? Well, the whole core of contractarianism is that we're doing this in order to better serve our self-interests. Okay, well, here's a way that I can serve my self-interest even better. Free ride every single time that I can get away with it. How can, let's say, for instance, Hobbes respond to something like that, right? And just to be really clear, here's the structure of the dialectic, right? The whole point of social contract theory is to serve your self-interests. Free riding serves your self-interests. So why not free ride? And of course, the intuition here being that there should be something wrong with free riding. Here's the perhaps easiest case. If everyone were a free rider, we would just be back to the state of nature, right? So clearly there's something here that's up. All right, so the only way to solve this problem is to show that it is irrational to free ride, right? And that's going to be a tall order. So here's what Schaefer-Landau says on the issue. If the claim is that it is always irrational to free ride, where what it means to be irrational here would be to neglect your self-interest when you stand only to benefit and not at all to lose, you're just not going to get that, right? The fact of the matter is there are times when it serves your self-interests to free ride. We don't like that. That sounds bad. It's a point against the theory, right? It's just not going to be true that it's always practically irrational, right? To free ride, there are plenty of instances where it's not irrational, where it really does serve your self-interests. Okay, so what else could Hobbes say? And here's what Schaefer-Landau proposes, and I think it's perfectly sensible. It's not that it's irrational every single instance it's not that it's irrational in every instance to free ride. Fine, there may be instances where it's rational. However, it is irrational to be a free rider. It's irrational, to put it differently, it is irrational to be a person who is not just. So now we're talking about dispositions, right? Now we're talking about the kinds of things that people are disposed to do. And it is irrational to be disposed to free ride, right? One easy reason that we can give is just if everyone did it, then of course the system would collapse. But really there's a different reason, which is sooner or later you're going to get caught. And that's just probably true, right? If you're the kind of person who free rides, sooner or later, for instance, we have the IRS. Okay, fine, whatever, it's not a perfect system, but people who cheat on their taxes have a tendency of getting caught. Minor cheating, maybe not. Big cheating, definitely, right? And so being a free rider always comes along with some degree of risk, right? And the idea is just this, that risk is pretty big, especially if you're the kind of person who free rides. So don't free ride. All right, so that's not perfect, right? Again, it doesn't really solve the first issue, and that still seems to be an issue. What if you know? What if you know that in this particular case, you're not going to get caught? There's really not much that the social contract theorists can say against that. Realize, here's what they can't say. They can't say, well, free riding is morally wrong. The thing that underlies all of these moral rules is self-interest. So why on earth would the whole reason I got into the social contract was to serve my self-interests. So it's just not going to cut it to respond by saying, well, free riding is bad. Not unless the contractarian can come up with a principled reason that's consistent with the theory of contractarianism as to why you shouldn't free ride. So, okay, contractarianism has a free rider problem. That's one issue, right? There, I said there were a few. Here's a second problem. Consent. The whole point of the social contract theory is that this is supposed to be a society that we consent to live in. How many of you have actually consented to live in this society? I don't remember when I was born anybody handing me a contract and me saying, hey, these terms and conditions sound great. Let me sign on the dotted line. We don't do that. Apart from the actual people who build the first social contract, we don't ever decide to do this. Because it turns out, for starters, that's not feasible, right? You might think, well, maybe when someone hits the age of consent, then we can go ahead, the age of reason, right? Maybe that's when you're 18, maybe it's when you're 21, I have no idea. All right, but whenever that's supposed to be, maybe that's when we go ahead and give you the contract and say, hey, do you consent to live by these rules? Maybe before, the age of adulthood, right? So before 18, I'll call it the age of consent. Maybe before you hit 18 years old, the rationale is, well, you're not old enough to make this kind of decision, so your parents can be paternalistic and, whatever. But again, first of all, that's just going to be impractical, right? And second of all, what do you do with the people who don't agree, right? Someone reads the terms and conditions when they turn 18 and they say, hey, yeah, this kind of sucks. I don't agree to live by these rules. Okay, so are they now allowed to rob banks and kill people? Doesn't really seem like it would be the right result. And yet it seems like contractarianism requires that people consent. Okay, so obviously, that sounds like an issue. Contractarians do have a response, and it is, I think, viable. There are two responses, actually. Here's the first. I don't think it's the best. We could say that people tacitly consent, right? So by living under these rules and by not having objected to them and by, blah, 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 you tacitly consent. Okay, so first and foremost, there absolutely is such a thing as tacit consent, right? I like the example that Schaefer-Landau gives. We've experienced this in this class together, right? When I'll ask whether we're good to move on, right, to the next subject. Very few students actually nod their heads, but I take the fact that you all remain quiet and whatnot as tacit consent, right? That this is allowed, that we can move on to the next subject, right? So we do that. We allow social norms to dictate sometimes, when it is that we've consented to something without having to explicitly state, right, that we're cool with what's going on, because whatever, we're clearly going along with it, we're clearly fine with it, right? There are plenty of cases where that happens, such as in the classroom setting, where that's not problematic. That said, there are also many cases where staying quiet is not consent, right? Where staying quiet does not mean that you're okay with what's going on. And in the context of society, there are plenty of people who not only remain quiet, right, and still grit their teeth and aren't happy with how things are going, but you've got plenty of groups who very vocally claim that they don't consent, right, that they're not cool with society's current rules and so on and so forth, right? Okay, so how can the contractarian respond to these people who are objecting, right, who are not cool with what's going on, be it that they are vocal about it or that they just tacitly grit their teeth and aren't happy with the way that society is going? Are they allowed to skirt the rules? Are they allowed to just do whatever they want? Should we exile them? Is that the right move there? Should they just move somewhere else, right? So again, here the contractarian does have the tools to say something. In fact, I think that their response here is maybe a little bit better than the response to the free rider problem. And the idea is just to remember, at no point did you actually have to construct a social contract to get the results that the social contract theorist wants. The whole point is that the social contract is whatever it is that ideal, rational, free, equal people would agree to, not what they did agree to. And the idea here is you can rest assured that the actual rules of the real social contract, those are good. Those are rules that you would want to live by were you a rational, perfect person, all these different ways, right? Free, equal, so on and so forth. Not the actual rules of society. And the rules that people are currently fighting against and that they find are unjust are not the rules of a just society, right? They're not the rules that the social contract would lay out. So yes, they can fight for that progress and so on and so forth, and it's okay to do those things. And no, they're not allowed to go around murdering, because we can be pretty confident that murdering is against, right, the rules of the ideal social contract. So consent actually doesn't really play a role here, at least not in the sense of actual consent to actual rules. It's conditional consent, right? Subjunctive consent, counterfactual consent, right? You would consent to the rules, were you behind the veil of ignorance, and if everyone agreed upon these things. And there are other problems here, right? Like how do we know exactly? I guess there are a few problems. One is, why should we consent, or why should we think we would consent to the rules chosen by people who are clearly very, very different from us? There are no ideal reasoners, right? There are no perfectly free individuals to choose from. I'm not going to answer that. That's actually just a very good question, right? That's not to say that the social contract theorist can't find an answer. It's just to say that whatever the jury's still out, right? We're still trying to work on that. I shouldn't even say we. I'm not saying that I'm a social contract theorist, but social contract theorists, right, still have to sort of figure this stuff out. But whatever, the point, right, to keep things simple. They can address the consent issue. At least they can make progress on it by saying that actual consent is not what's required. It's just that the rules are such that we would consent to them, right? We would agree to them were they determined in this highly free, highly fair way, right? Okay. Final problem, and this is one that we've seen before. Okay, fine, there are many, many other problems, but here's the last one we're going to talk about, and then I'll give you a brief summary, right? And this is just the problem of the moral community, once again. According to contractarians, right, the people who determine the social contract are the rational, free, equal people, right? The ones who are perfect reasoners and so on and so forth. Squirrels aren't really playing a role here. In fact, squirrels wouldn't show up anywhere in the social contract. We wouldn't really have any reason to bring them up, because they're just not really relevant to how it is that we structure a society, right? And look, maybe we would have rules about how we treat animals and whatnot, but it's not clear how that would really give them any moral status beyond just, we just so happened to care about them. And that seems to get something seriously wrong, because it seems like we do still have moral obligations to cows and squirrels and whatever, pick your favorite, and crocodiles, I don't know, whatever. The point is, fine, we don't owe them everything, but certainly we owe them not to bother them unless it's absolutely necessary. You're not allowed to torture them. You're not allowed to do that kind of thing. And it doesn't seem like the social contract theory has the tools to deal with them. Here, once again, we'll notice that there are some similarities between social contract theory and Kant. In this case, both require that the members of the moral community be those who are rational, those capable of consent, right? Those capable of agreeing. And the problem isn't just animals, right? It's also human, right? Human animals, because there are plenty of humans who are equally capable of not consenting to this, right? And I don't just have in mind infants, though of course they also count. You've got human beings who are incapacitated and can't they can't reason, they can't make decisions for themselves. And if social contract theory is right, at least as I've construed it thus far, those would not form members of the social community either, and so we wouldn't owe them anything. Here's another way of putting that. What's the point of making the social contract again? Well, it's to make sure that I get something in exchange for what I've given, right? So I'm sacrificing my freedom so that I can get something in return. And of course, who is it that I'm thinking about? Well, I'm thinking about the people who can give me things, right? I'm thinking about people like you, like my neighbor, right? So on and so forth. People whom I can owe something to and who might owe me something in return. I just don't have that kind of relationship with any squirrel, right? There is no squirrel who could really give me anything that I want. I'm not really looking for acorns, right? And even if I did want acorns, I don't think the squirrel would be particularly interested in consenting, right? Also, all of us are much stronger than most animals, right? Than a lot of animals. We could just take it by force. Not saying we should, not saying that's good. I'm saying that they just don't factor into the social contract, and so this is a weakness of the theory because it seems to be leaving out something that we think is really important, right? It's not just about humans out there, right? There are other creatures as well. Okay, so super brief recap, right? So remember, state of nature and the prisoner's dilemma, right? So prisoner's dilemma is, of course, just precisely the problem that it seems like without an enforcer, it seems like without some external force to make sure that we cooperate, it's just always most rational for us to behave in our self-interest because it's too much of a risk to do otherwise. And the state of nature is just a prisoner's dilemma just everywhere all the time, right? So the state of nature is just an awful state. No one wants to live in a state of nature. In comes the social contract theory, right? And the social contract theorist says that the moral rules, right, the things that we ought to do, are those that rational, free, equal people would agree to, right, under the veil of ignorance. It doesn't have to be the veil of ignorance, but for our purposes, for this class, yes, right? Let's just say it's the veil of ignorance. Okay, so if we all put that on, we would come up with certain rules. Those rules would be the most fair, right? They would benefit everyone as much as possible because you don't know where you're going to end up in society. And then with that said, of course, you end up getting the system. You need an enforcer. You need the rules. You follow those because they're just, right? So on and so forth. And right, you're also allowed to break the rules under very specific sets of circumstances, specifically when the rules aren't fair, right? Or when your own life is being threatened. And then finally, we considered problems, right? And the three problems that I want you to know about are, one, the free rider problem, right? And that's someone who takes without sacrificing anything in return. You've got the problem of consent, right? And that's precisely that it doesn't really seem like any of us consented to this. And of course, the contractarian has replies to both of these issues. And then the third is the problem of the moral community, right? And that is that it seems like contractarianism leaves out entities that should be, right, creatures that should be members of the moral community. None of these are devastating, right? Contractarians can and do have replies to varying degrees of success for every one of these problems, but they are problems, right? And I want you to know them because they'll be on the test. So work in your own self-interest. Watch this video more than once. Do the readings, right? And get a good grade on your papers and finals. Okay, that's enough lecturing of both the academic and the individual kind. Thanks for watching this. I'm gonna leave it up, right? So you can watch it as much as you want until the end of the semester, and I'll see you in class on Monday. Goodbye, everyone.